Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making the time. Uh, I'm Bill Coleman. This is part of our Indigenous Awareness Weeks at McGill University, but for our own faculty at the School of Continuing Studies. As I said, I'm Belvin Coburn. I'm an associate professor of public administration and governance here. I'm also the faculty chair of the Indigenous Relations Initiative, and I'm a member of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan. We're the one sort of Algonquin Reserve on the Ontario side, just about an hour and a half west of Ottawa. But today we're going to be exploring how Indigenous business management and capacity building can be a catalyst for economic reconciliation in Canada. And I'm very heartened to have our guest speakers here today. It was a little bit ad hoc putting this together, but David Acko Carriere is an assistant professor here, and I'll let all the guests introduce themselves more fully. But also Matt Garrow from the federal government and Angela McCune is well here too, that have deep understanding and play or at least probably it won't be too narcissistic, but more humble to say a tangential role in economic reconciliation. So we're going to talk about federal and provincial investments, especially in defense, how they can either widen or close the gap for Indigenous participation in the economy, and as well as general, I guess, federal policy and Crown Indigenous relations in this respect too. So first, I'm going to pass it over to who will be the most predominant speaker here, is guiding his invited guest here today is Professor David Acko Carriere.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to be here to be able to talk about the program. I'm coming in with two hats, actually. One hat is an Indigenous entrepreneur, and I've been an Indigenous entrepreneur running a management consulting practice since 2006, and it was really a reconciliation project born out of the Oka crisis, where Angela and I were reservists at the time, but I was feeling up helicopters wondering, why am I here? Before then, I was always sort of like mistaken as I say this lovingly, as a tall Filipino, but no one really realizing that I was Indigenous. So when I finally came out and said I was Indigenous, people would say, well, what are you doing here? That kind of thing. And so I'd become, over that time, I became sort of an Indigenous apologist. And that was sort of my rude awakening to what reconciliation really meant. About 2006, after one of the things that you've got to think about is after the Oka crisis, was the Royal Commission on the Aboriginal Peoples, and that was the first time Canada asked about Indigenous people about Indigenous people. Before, they used to ask everybody else, and that's how policy was formed by everybody else but ourselves. And then, of course, that led to, believe it or not, Aboriginal Day or Indigenous Day that we have, and then of course to the Truth and Reconciliation, which will be the Orange Shirt Day, which we'll be celebrating, but we'll be, sorry, I lost my orange shirt here, which we'll be looking at over the next. We'll be observing actually tomorrow, but there's many reasons for that, truth and reconciliation, and that's sort of like Canada hitting the reset button. In terms of its Indigenous relations. So since 2006, we've been doing management consulting, and moreover, there's about 80 of us working from coast to coast to coast. The company's called Coastas Consulting Services. Nothing to do with our last name. It's just a bad pronunciation for Arrow and Cree. I didn't realize that one of the things is I was swampy, and Costas is actually Plains Cree, so in the dialect. And from that management consulting practice, eventually McGill came calling, and they asked me if I wanted to teach business management, and I readily accepted, because one of the things I wanted to do was I actually wanted to bring in reconciliation inside of business programs, because I thought that was a big challenge and needed to be addressed. And then eventually now, I'm now the Indigenous Business Management, what they call academic programmer. And I work with both the professors and with the administration in terms of promoting the program like we're doing right now, but also helping design the program and supporting professors and students in the program. So I do have a bit of a thought about that, and we're going to explore that a little bit further. But that's a little bit about me, and I'm happy to be here. And thank you, Veldon and Dina, for organizing this.
Yes, thank you, David. I'll pass it over to Angela if she could take a moment to introduce herself.
Sure, sure. So, first of all, again, thank you for having me here. It's a privilege, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion. My background is in aerospace and defense. I spent more than 3 decades in that realm in business development primarily. And then I took a pivot to my career, and I got into offsets and industrial cooperation around 2021, and that led me to CAE, and I spent a couple of years there, and I started to get involved in the Indigenous engagement aspect of offsets, and I actually love that that aspect, and a little bit of that was related to conversations I had with David around that time. As our paths keep throughout our lives, we're destined to work
Always run into
together.
each other.
Yes, exactly.
Uh,
So, go
Angela's being
ahead.
very kind because I've known her since high school. So, the first years of junior high. So that's how far back Angela and I go.
Yeah, and we tend to weave in and out of each other's acquaintances. So then about a year and a half ago, I joined MDA Space. And I'll just mention too, I spent a stint in the Canadian Armed Forces Reserve, and I saw David there as well. I worked on helicopters, so I do have that sort of hands-on in the Canadian Armed Forces space. And at MDA, I manage offsets and ITBs on certain defense programs, but I'm also very much involved in MDA's Indigenous engagement initiatives, which I'm very which is probably the most exciting part of my job. So thank you. I can talk a little bit more about ITBs later. I guess we'll that, go from there.
Great, thank you, Angela. And last but not least, Matt Garrow.
Thanks, Sheldon, and thanks, David, for the invitation. And happy to be here as well. And looking forward to this conversation about economic reconciliation and procurement and other various important economic initiatives that are underway. I'm a director at Indigenous Services Canada, largely responsible for leading a policy team that tries to coordinate how our department and in some instances how the federal government approaches economic reconciliation. And I am a member of Sagamok First Nation, also with deep roots in Akwesasne, and so I want to acknowledge, of course, the territory in which we're on today. I'm on Algonquin territory in Ottawa, but I think most of you, if you're in Montreal, on Haudenosaunee land and territory, and so I want to acknowledge that as well. Again, happy to be here, speak to the federal role, which I'm hoping is becoming diminishing over the years in terms of designing policies for Indigenous people. And I'll speak to, I think, sort of an existential approach we're trying to implement across government that gives way to Indigenous leadership in designing and implementing policies in support and service of their own economies. So we'll get into that. So I'm looking forward to, again, today's conversation.
All right, make wedge for that. So generally, I think probably our audience that's joined us is, very business focused. David is the academic program coordinator for the Indigenous Business Management program. But before we get to talk to all that is, I guess the voracious sort of appetite for people to learn about this, especially at this timing, tomorrow's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, but economic reconciliation. General question that I'll put to the three of you before we kind of go down sort of your more specific channels is, what does economic reconciliation mean and what does it look like, generally speaking? So maybe I'll go back to David first.
Sure. And my view of the world, that kind of is basically, when I look at reconciliation to me is putting things back in the right order. when Canada first, well, when the first settlers came across, or even the first explorers they came across, it was based on finding the trade route to China. So in fact, that's why we were called Indians, because Columbus got lost and he thought he hit India, and it stuck. So he was looking for trade routes. He was looking for ways to get to the spices, and we just happened to be in the way. But having that brought opportunity and so on and so forth to Europe, or the kings and queens of old. But what it meant is that it started off as a partnership. It's partnership in commerce, and it was a nation to nation relationship. That's why we have treaties. Treaties are not between provinces or between cities. There's, unless you're in Europe and you had city states, but it was between countries. And so they recognized, Indigenous people as a country. So, and there was, the Tuawa Wampum Belt. There was all sorts of agreements that were made, but that fell into disorder to where we are today. So when I look, and especially around economics, because of this total imbalance and misrepresentation. So one of the things that I'm very passionate about is economic reconciliation, because it's an opportunity to put things back in the right order from a business context. And one of the things, the other hat I'm wearing is actually doing a doctorate at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And the study I'm looking at is economic reconciliation and shared value creation. These are not foreign concepts. Shared value creation as Michael Porter, in McGill University, and he's kind of looked at it from that viewpoint. So when I look at economic reconciliation, I see government, which Matt's here, and I see industry, which is Angela, and I see community, which is which is represented by me as an Indigenous person from the Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation, um, and also as an Indigenous entrepreneur. And where those are meeting is where I think where economic reconciliation or economics happens, or economic reconciliation happens. So so this is where we have these shared how you say shared values, and they're not the same. I mean, there's a Western shared value, the way they look at in terms of what is creating value and wealth creation, and there's Indigenous ways of knowing, which is another way of looking at shared value and wealth creation. So when you look at it from an overall picture, it's the betterment of people. So or and providing that opportunity in most cases, So and that's what I think reconciliation is about, putting things back in the right order.
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll go back to Matt, or no, maybe I'll leave Matt till the last, because he has a insider perspective as being Indigenous and within Indigenous Services Canada. So Angela, please, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so economic reconciliation from our standpoint, industry standpoint, is well, leveraging government spend, large government spend, to stimulate economic benefits and capacity and growth within Indigenous businesses and communities. And I think that one of the key things there might be going from, say, transactional relationships, like, oh, I'm doing business, and to really true partnerships where Indigenous businesses are embedded within the supply chain of, for instance, MDA Space. And MDA Space is seeking small, medium businesses and partners, but we as I say, we would love to have more Indigenous businesses as part of our supply chain. And I think that goes to building a stronger economy. We will all benefit from that. And I think David had provided some information with respect to the amount of GDP that Indigenous businesses are providing to Canada. So important to have that as part of the defense industrial base.
So just to build a little bit on what Angela has said, is, when you look at the Canadian economy is in Indigenous territory. It is in either historical treaties or in new comprehensive land claim agreements. And this is kind of teeing up Matt a little bit to talk about that. But generally speaking, and being left out of the economy, when you can take a look at the NORAD defense up in the Arctic, for the longest time, Indigenous communities were not part of that. Raytheon was part of that, and there was no Indigenous participation. But that has changed through policy, and has changed through many ways that now businesses have to start forming into their, start putting into their supply chain, but also the way they do contracting as well. Now we have an Indigenous company that's actually doing all of the NORAD replacement on the new equipment and so on and so forth. So, when I look at it from the perspective of why it makes business sense, is that, from an MDA perspective, and correct me, keep me honest here, Angela, is the fact that a lot of these operations and maintenance are not going to happen down in where MDA is in BC or in Ontario or in Quebec. They're going to happen on the territory. So they need people to work on this. They need people to supply equipment to the ground stations, and also from the from a manufacturing point, we have land and people, and this is a very good benefit and partnership for a company like MDA, and also to meet the government commitments of economic reconciliation.
Yeah, thanks for that, both Angela and David. So for Matt Garrow, who's the senior director of titled responsible for economic reconciliation. I know you're not political staff, so no political questions or positions to be here, but to give us an insight, both as being Indigenous and working in Indigenous Services Canada on the side of the Crown, and in the last 10 years or so, ever since the previous Trudeau government, the mandate letters that come out to your ministers, deputy ministers, what have you, stipulate that this is reconciliation and no relationship is more important. So not to give away any kind of secrets on the other side, but tell us, from your perspective on Indigenous economic reconciliation between the Crown and our nations. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I mean, there's not a consensus on what it means, but in terms of how the discourse has emerged the last 10 years after the TRC final report, the term generally means the full inclusion of Indigenous economies into the Canadian economy. It means control of and establishment of an economic agenda by Indigenous governments and communities. It means that all the actors have to understand their responsibility in ensuring that Indigenous communities achieve their economic goals. For the federal government, it means dismantling barriers it has created that have in some ways disemboweled Indigenous economies that continue to prevent Indigenous communities from achieving their economic objectives. There's still a myriad of laws, policies in place that inhibit economic growth. So our job within government is to identify those barriers and figure out what is the best and fastest way to dismantle them in accordance with, in partnership with Indigenous governments. What we have tried to do is within the government is imbue a sense of less dictatorial approaches to economic development, more listening to what Indigenous experts, institutions, governments have posited as the right way forward, and then support that. We have tried to say that we have a long track record of many failures in terms of trying to support Indigenous economies. Some of the actions are quite overt in how they have dismantled economies as well. I could share a paper that our colleagues at CERNA did about how these overt actions really did, in a really terrible way, undermine the abilities for Indigenous governments to control their economies. So those are things that we're cognizant of, and we're trying to ensure that government departments, our colleagues, can support the notion that the expertise is within Indigenous communities. Some communities are well ahead of others, some are still emerging, some are requiring far more support. Our job is to figure out what is a flexible way to support the economic visions that are established by Indigenous communities. It's not one size fits all. It is not one sort of sectoral approach. It is not one answer. It's not a loan guarantee. It's not a procurement policy. It is several things government has to do to support those aspirations by Indigenous governments.
Thank you. So the second part of my question I would have put to you is with that general understanding in mind. And, as a political scientist, I work more on sort of the social aspects of reconciliation, is that there's a lot of damage done to our social institutions. But indeed, as David had pointed out in prefacing a lot of the conversation, was our economic relations too. And they were, considerably damaged, as Matt, you rightly point out, and but beyond that, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about some of the specificities of what it might, I don't want to say really look like when Indigenous businesses are treated as equal partners in Canada's economy. I wonder, I think maybe David might have some particulars that he could think off the top of his head, and Angela definitely from your industry. But yeah, we'll circle back to you, Matt, for giving us that side.
Sure, I'm more than happy to. Traditionally in businesses that we're talking, you talk about MBA, doing an MBA, a Master's of Business Administration, where, business students are taught, how to overcome competition or how to beat competition, which really amounts to, when I was first taking my MBA, they gave us the book of The Art of War. You have to look at it from the art of war, like how do you beat your enemy? How do you get that competitive advantage? And what I've seen, from, where things are zero-sum games, there's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser when they think about it, and it won't be me. And I don't have to look far. I look at the rhetoric that comes out of the United States, through the president of the United States. His biggest fear is to be a loser, that kind of thing, because he always wants to be a winner. So, and then whatever that looks like, that's his operandi. That's how way he operates. And a lot of businesses operate that way. And that's why you're seeing this kind of greatest transfer of wealth. At one point in time, I remember when I was first started going to study business, they said, 0.6 of the percentage of the population owns the nation's wealth in the United, or 6%, owns the nation's wealth. And now you look at it today and it's like less than 1%. And I'm going, well, what happened to the other 5%? But that's, you're looking for that transfer of wealth. In Indigenous communities, it's not like that. It's completely, really, believe it or not, it's the opposite. It's about collective wealth, and it's not communism in any way. It's the way you look at it from a seventh generation. And one of the things that was interesting is that wealth passes from mother to daughter. So that and it goes on like that. And men did politics and war and all sorts of other things, but that kind of thing. But wealth generations within that, and within that collective impact. And I think when we start looking at things from that lens, we start seeing sustainability. That's why you have dish one spoon, that kind of thing, that treaty of which is sustainability treaty. Or you have, the two wampum belt, where you have your canoe, I have my canoe. Together we'll move through the land and through history together. And we'll share the resources. So that collective view, and this is becoming very paramount, when you look at today's economy. So what Indigenous people bring is that sense of collective, collective existence. And this is, I think this is becoming more and more as I'm kind of going through this business, looking at the work that I'm doing with a PhD, but also looking at the role Indigenous people play, but also the role non-Indigenous people play as allyship, right? And we talk about two-eye seeing, which is, both being able to see from an Indigenous way of knowing and also from a Western way of knowing. So I think this is where Indigenous people bring the biggest value of reconfiguring how economies can operate within within this business world, or this economic reconciliation world. So as Matt talked a lot about, it's like, taking an Indigenous-led way of doing business, incorporating it as a valid business management process, and then being able to roll it out into communities. Especially when you talk about the one economy, the one Canadian economy, which is, estimated at $500 billion. Is it going to be a transfer of wealth? It's going to go to a few companies, or is it going to go and be able to, create a better society? And is it going to be a nation-to-nation society? Is Canada going to be the first country to become a nation-to-nation society? We're promoting it all over the world, with Israel and all the rest of this kind of stuff, believing in nation-to-nation. But can it be from this particular point? And I think economics and having economic reconciliation being part of that vehicle. So, in a long roundabout way, that's where I think where Indigenous people bring the biggest amount of value.
Thanks. I don't know if Matt or Angela, you want to follow up directly on that, or did we just want to go into an order? But
Yeah, if I could just, I think,
sure.
just to follow up on one particular point regarding, I think um, the 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 varied approaches to economic development are quite significant across the country. I think it's these processes, this cohort could be quite supportive at helping communities understand what it is from an economic vision it wants to achieve from a community perspective. It is not homogenous. It is not going to be classically about gross domestic product. What kind of risks does the government or does that Indigenous government want to take? How does it want to leverage its economic assets? Those are key questions that communities have to figure out to establish, one, the vision, and then two, how do they measure the efficacy or success of their strategies? Those are really important. We've seen some communities take a lot of risk with respect to the economic ventures they employ. Haisla Nation has a liquefied natural gas facility in their territory. The environmental risks are quite high, but that's a particular approach they're prepared to take and have done quite successfully. And they will see tremendous economic returns from a classic, again, gross domestic product, but at what cost? And I think I'm not judging, positively, negatively that exercise, but they seem pretty confident in their approach. That's pretty, I find that particular approach, understanding what the risks are, and then working through that. Others are very wary of traditional petroleum gas extraction processes. Fully understand that. So they have to figure out exactly what it is they want to achieve and how they want to measure it, and go about it at employing strategies, and we'll achieve those. Again, we're trying to build flexible tools that can support governments where they're at, and understanding what risks they want to take, and then acquiring capital to achieve that. But those are things governments are grappling with right now across the country. And it is, an exciting time to also see an array of institutions that are well positioned to support that. There's the First Nation Finance Authority, the First Nation Financial Management Board. There is the First Nation Major Projects Coalition. They're all there to support the aspirations for governments. And again, I think it's a good thing that the federal government takes a back seat in that process, because again, our track record hasn't been that good. So.
Thanks, Angela. If you
Yeah, the only bit I was going to add with respect to defense, excuse me, projects is basically, and I think it falls in line with some of the things that David and Matt were saying, that instituting early consultation forums. So making that a standard process, but mind you, each community is different, each project is different, but and I really, one of the things I was also going to mention was defining success and having discussions around that, because maybe the community doesn't, maybe there are different viewpoints, and perhaps that, those discussions help to build trust and really bring about mutually identified project outcomes, hopefully. And maybe there's an element of from the point of industry, maybe there's an element of cultural awareness training that has to occur, supporting those discussions. So that's my only.
And just to build up a little bit what Angela said, right? The component, I always remind people, there's only 1.9 million of us, running around, and that number is increasing more because of the more babies we're having than most most of Canadians are. But also the fact that there's people becoming more aware, or reclaiming their indigeneity, and that's still an open question. I won't get into that. That's a whole different other discussion. But what we're seeing is this increasing. So what Canada, I think, is going through, a change management exercise. It's trying to break away from its 150-year past of the Indian Act, and try and figure, well, what does that look like going into the future? As Matt pointed out, the devolution of the Indian Act is very much on the mind of Indigenous people, and very much on the mind of certain parts of government. But there's only 1.9 million of us running around. So allyship is becoming very, very poignant, or very, very part of that Canadian strategy, what that allyship looks like. And I still think that that's an evolving story. But you do through education. You do through, like Angela said, cultural awareness. But cultural awareness is one part of it. Well, how do I reconfigure my supply chain to meet the needs? How do I reconfigure my supply chain to meet communities where they are? How do I, but not only withstanding that, or human resources point of view, or community investments in terms of, from the government point of view, or even from an institutional point of view, which is the Indigenous Business Management program, that the way I'm deciding to roll out as the academic program coordinator, it's not just make it an Indigenous thing. It's not. It's a Canadian thing. So to bring in non-Indigenous people into the program as well, to work on Indigenous problems. So one of the things I did in my the lessons in strategic management was I take community development plan. And I actually have my non-Indigenous students work on one of the aspects, like youth employment or entrepreneurship, or they have a mining company that's working closely. How do you build up to your strategy to meet that? And it's really interesting because I get two reactions. One is, wow, I never thought about this, and this is really amazing. Or the other thing, give me a Tesla. I want to work on Tesla. I said, okay, well, anybody can work on that. That's available. But this kind of strategic thinking is, first of all, it's Canadian. That's number one. And number two, it's very challenging to think about things, and that business courses don't take, like remote communities and infrastructure and all sorts of other things that are required for a really good business mind to think holistically. So, and that's, I think, is the allyship that needs to be created and along those ways to move this towards economic reconciliation and support Angela's business, but also support Indigenous communities and support government. So I'll kind of leave it at that, in terms of the role.
Right. So something that comes up out of what we were talking about, and which was also sort of my next question, was the lack in several communities, and Matt had alluded to some of the directions, and so we're not really making a whole lot of normative judgments too. So there are, a lot of people think, sort of environmentalists say, well, Indigenous peoples, they don't want all this economic development, would, especially at the risk to the environment, especially in this particular political or cultural moment. Whereas there are these incursions into our territories where we're realigning, I guess, our trade patterns and international trade agreements to sort of divorce from the United States, and at the risk of declining exports to our number one consumer, is, well, you know what, we need to go into those rural and remote regions of Canada, which are predominantly Indigenous populated, where we still have our treaty rights, our constitutionally protected Aboriginal rights, that the extractive industries, they're going to go in, and there's some risk, the political risk too. I think Angela alludes a little bit to it, but the question being is, like, so how does it become, we ensure being led, because we know that a lot of businesses understand that there will be Indigenous resistance. As those in Northwestern Ontario have said in the Ring of Fire, is like, we're not adverse to economic development. You just have to have our consent and coordinate. So it's no longer the business case that they can go in with the backing of the state, because businesses know that they'll be tied up either in courts for several years, and their project will never get off the ground. So what in economic reconciliation is avoiding that sort of general outlook. Anyone? Sorry.
Yeah. I don't know, Matt, you want to pick up this thread? This is like your wheelhouse here. So, yeah.
It is, and I'm fascinated by the sort of the push on major projects right now. We understand the sort of the economic urgency of that. I'm a bit of a bystander because I don't have any regulatory responsibility, so I can push on supporting economic initiatives led by Indigenous communities. The government of Canada is pushing hard on major projects. Veldon alluded to the consultation obligations are there. There are constitutionally protected rights that must be respected. Supreme Court of Canada has been quite clear. National interest is not an override of Aboriginal rights. It's only met if the consultation and the honor of the crown obligations are discharged honorably and effectively. So it's, again, they're not in opposition. You just have to ensure that the process by which you obtain consent is there. And that means to be fully informed. And then form part can't just be the Indigenous community be informed as to the nature of the impact, but also governments have to be honorable in terms of understanding the deep impact of whatever activity they're proposing to approve is understood. Rarely have we seen major projects be disapproved because of the impact to Aboriginal communities. I'll be very curious to see which of these projects are mothballed because of the deep environmental impacts. I suspect there will be some, but we'll have to see exactly what's done in the next 5 years in terms of that economic agenda. But it will be, I think, very fascinating to see how governments understand their obligations with respect to Indigenous communities and ensuring that the economic projects don't harm the communities without their consent. That's going to be a process that I'm closely following and monitoring.
And just to build a little bit on what Matt said, it's besides the environmental impact, which is I'm not trying to diminish that because we're 7 generations people, right? So what we do today impacts, 150 years from now. I don't have to look far, look at the Indian Act, right? So we're feeling the effects of the 7th generation or even the 8th generation for that matter. And then we're here cleaning that up, just in this call alone. But there's also, besides, there's also the economic side of it, which is, the partnership side of it, the wealth sharing side of it, the investment side of all these developments. And of course, Angela's feeling the pinch of this through the Indigenous participation plans, in terms of what is industry going to bring to bring Canadian value, which is, the 4th bullet and the One Canadian Economy Act, which is Indigenous participation. So there's no ways around it. They're going to get to that. So one of the challenges is going to be, I personally think, besides, we've been operating in 2 solitudes, and without understanding which each other's groups are, our needs are, and all the rest is kind of good stuff, from a business perspective, from a Canadian settler perspective, also from an Indigenous perspective, an Indigenous business perspective. And what's I think is going to, we'll have to find the processes that are respectful to everything that Matt has said, but also everything that Angela is, thinking about, because they're shareholders and all the rest of this kind of stuff. They're driven by the bottom line. Some of them, other ones are driven by, societal impact, so, or impact investment. There's a cohort of, Indigenous investors that are not just Indigenous, but everybody else, that are looking at, we don't want to have, development at any cost. So no, Indigenous people are not against, development, but it's not at any cost. It's not. And I can look at one particular case just outside of Tsuut'ina First Nations when Canderel here in Montreal went to build, the retail park. The community said, no, we're not against that. But if you contaminate the groundwater, it's a no-go. If you change the environment, it's a no-go. So they made Canderel and the architects go right back to the drawing board, and they talk about this. If you go to their website, they'll see it. You'll see it. Tsuut'ina First Nations, with their retail project, and they made them go back to the drawing board. They made them look at the water. They made them look at all sorts of things before that development happened, and that's a very good, successful partnership between community needs, youth employment, community investment. Basically a good form of economic reconciliation with non-Indigenous businesses and government. That's a success story. Another success story I can think of is Terry Paul, from Clearwater, the purchase of Clearwater, $1 billion. This is unheard of, and this is just before the pandemic. He's going to invest with a partnership with Premium Foods in Vancouver and East Coast side of it. And anybody knows in Business 101, that kind of thing. You expand your market. So Premium Food was a great deal for Terry Paul. He had a different view of the world. He wanted to secure the fishing grounds for his community in Nova Scotia. Did he have all the communities at the time on board? He only had 3 or 4 at that time, and the rest were wait and see. But now you have him basically bringing on more communities to do fishing with lobster when they bought up Clearwater. And that's a good case as well. And now they're buying out their partner, with debt equity, and of course going to the institutions that Matt just talked about. That's being Indigenous-led. And one of the biggest things that I can think of right now, prior to that purchase, the Department of Fisheries, the RCMP, and the Indigenous communities are crashing boats into each other, literally, and coming to fisticuffs, over the territory rights. And now I look what Terry Paul is at. I don't hear the sound of crashing boats anymore. What I hear the sound is fishing, but also for the non-Indigenous people, because they hire the non-Indigenous fishery boats as well to do contracts. So that's a good success story in terms of when Indigenous people, have led their particular projects and the way they do things, and Indigenous partnerships or true partnerships with the non-Indigenous community or settler community really works well together in this collective view, and changing the way business looks at itself. It's unsustainable right now, our current Western models. That's the bottom line. What's going to be the new approach?
Right,
And
our Western models have typically just been colonial incursions and extractions to the detriment of Indigenous people. So, wealth hoarding, land grabbing, what have you, too. So, Angela, any perspective that you might bring on, I guess, working in partnership with Indigenous peoples on this?
So my perspective comes from the defense industry, and I know we haven't touched on. I see the time flying, and I think we could probably have this last another hour. But I did want to touch on the $9 billion upcoming spend that Canada has committed to, and hopefully I'm not derailing your questions, because that provides an opportunity. So the government has a couple of tools that can definitely benefit Indigenous businesses and engagement. So I don't know, I can go a little bit into those tools, but there's the ITB policy and there's the IPP, which David has kind of mentioned. And the ITB policy actually requires that basically it's Canada's tool to leverage defense spending towards economic growth and stimulate economic growth. And so the policy requires that for large defense contracts, imagine $9 billion, that these contracts must inject back into the economy an amount equal to the value of the contract. And there's certain other sub-obligations that go along with that Indigenous businesses could potentially benefit from. So often on these contracts, there's a requirement for small, medium businesses engagement to the extent of 10 to 15% the value of the contract, which is huge. There's also skills development requirements in ITB policy. So that, I think we didn't talk about education and STEM and so forth, but that is an area that if, for instance, MDA has invested in scholarships with the organization Inspire for Indigenous student scholarships, and those types of investments will give you 5 times what you put in terms of credits. So there's a huge incentive there to invest in skills development and training with Indigenous peoples and post-secondaries. There's also potential for investment frameworks, and that means that there can be multipliers, again, 9 times the amount of the amount that the contractor puts into the investment framework could be 9 times the value of your credits. So it has to be following certain rules. For instance, it has to be a small, medium business, could be an Indigenous business, which are typically small, medium, as things are growing in the defense industry. And that means another huge opportunity. So, and then I could talk about IPPs, where there is a sort of a minimum 5% target to include Indigenous businesses in direct work related to those contracts. But it's more than that. They're more than that. Those IPPs are basically a plan as to how you're going to engage with Indigenous businesses, how you're going to hire folks that are Indigenous, how you're going to develop skills and engage with the communities. So, and I'll just mention here that these IPP, this tool is not applied consistently across all defense projects. So there's a potential loss of opportunity there. So if that IPP was applied consistently, then we could have planning ahead of time. We know that we have to engage with Indigenous business. We know that we have to bring awareness, and that we can build the trust, build up relationships versus transactional. You know, tick in the box. I did business with an Indigenous, and I think to me and to MDA those are very important. Points is to develop partnerships versus a one-off transactional type relationship. So yeah, and so another thing that I might mention is with respect to IPPs, perhaps there are ways to improve, and those might mean incentivize reward bidders by if they contribute more than that 5%, maybe have a reward, have a greater chance of winning that business. Incentivize high value contributions. For instance, if you contribute to a business that is involved in AI or some R&D potential or higher skilled type of employees, maybe you get higher points. So those are things to be discussed, but yeah, those the IPP and the ITB policies are amazing. I think tools that should be leveraged more, and more awareness should be brought to businesses and communities about the potential benefits.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know it.
So just to build upon what Angela's just basically said is, so one of the things about industrial technical benefits, those are the ITBs. So this is where government and gets companies to invest in Canada, that kind of thing. They don't make any distinction within the industrial technical benefits or the ITB policy. We're trying to change that. So that's just to give Matt a heads up here. We're trying to change that in the sense that because it's Section 30, we're Section 35 people. In other words, we're rights holders. Therefore, we're brought to a higher pitch, and that's it, which is good for Canada in general. And if I show you a map of comprehensive land claim agreements and friendship treaties and compared to the ones that are still unceded territory, you realize it's just the coastal towns, and this is unceded territory, and they're working on negotiations. In fact, Fraser Valley has fallen into a land claim, I believe, just recently in the news, the whole Fraser River. So having said that, the industrial technical benefits policy, or the ITB policy, actually it's very powerful in terms of when Orlikon was basically in Bromont, and they fell into an ITB policy. It actually built the industry that Bromont is. Bromont is an aerospace city, because it started off with the Orlikon, and then they're supporting, businesses, what we call tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 in the supply chain that are, and now if you look at Bromont today, from where it was before the ITB policy, it's a booming town, and now with the Quebec government saying we're going to put public investment in Quebec aerospace companies and defense companies, because of the $9 billion that could be spent, or the next $74 billion to $100 billion that could be spent in the next 20 years that the government's committed to. So they want to go to 5% of GDP. This is where, and knowing the fact that majority of where these bases are situated, and on the coast and in the north and in the interior, are all on traditional territory, so or unceded territory. So it moves everything into a higher pitch, and you have these vehicles. And the other thing is, right now, currently, the government has about over $100 billion in unspent commitments that they've been kicking down the road. That kind of thing. So just a policy change or something like that, which is not legislative, but a policy change, which could happen in 6 weeks, could unlock those dollars for an MDA to start leveraging, in terms of, commitments. I'm going to give Matt a chance to respond, because I want to show you what the IBM program is all about, so.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
David. Again, it's not an area of my expertise in terms of procurement
Okay.
policy, so I'm not gonna weigh in. Go.
Okay. So, yeah. But and to Angela's point, if industry is able to, leverage and say, okay, well, I'm going to build capacity. And one of the things I was going to talk about the IBM program a little bit here. Can I share my screen? Yeah, I can.
I
Yeah.
think so.
Yeah. So I should have made a dog and pony show for this, but I didn't. So, um, so one of the things is, look, if you go to the McGill website, and I'll just bring back people's lovely faces over here, is what it is a, a 30 credit part-time program, and it's offered online. So this is one thing that could be brought into community. A lot of communities have with learning centers. So this is an opportunity for McGill, for MDA to partner and make a program that actually builds up capacity in business management. So and offering it to not just to within community through the learning centers, online program, and Jen's basically saying this program could be finished in 2 years. Two courses in the spring, two courses in the fall, two courses in the spring, and one course in the summer. With 8 weeks when you think about all the breaks and in between. So it's not impossible for an Indigenous person in community to get the certificate. And when you look at what's being presented here, with the courses in management, they don't have the program courses. They didn't have the courses, but in the undergrad. So I mean, the program is it has accounting, and it has human resources.
The courses are at the top next to see program
Oh,
overview.
oh,
Yeah.
there it is. Yeah, here we go. Thank you. When you look at the courses and the fundamentals here, they're accounting, they're public administration courses. There's fundamental course, the introduction to business, which I'm teaching right now. This program is going to be, thought about because there's other parts of this program that I think that are being needed. Like, for example, information technology, I think should be part of it. Some courses, intro to it. I think there's STEMS foundations that are available. Computer programming. There's also supply chain management which is going to be big. One of the other things that we've been working on right now in the management entrepreneurship program is manufacturing. So one of the biggest things that communities can offer to industry, and the ability to use a band council resolution to start building manufacturing capability within within communities on and off reserve, and majority of communities believe 60% of them are near an urban center. We're not far up in the north and all the rest of this kind of stuff. We're also very much present. I have to look far. I look at Ganawage, I look at Ganasatagi, and one of the things we have is we have land and people. 30% of the manufacturing building cost is the building itself. The rest is human resources and processes and robotics and all sorts of interesting stuff like that. But when you knock off 30% of the cost just through a band council resolution, you can lease the land for 5 years. For the first 5 years, at a very, literally you can do it for $1 per year for the first 5 years as the way to offset the costs. That's interesting when you think about the new Canadian economy. And it was really interesting. I was talking to Julie, my wife, and she was saying that she was really upset because of the Trump effect. She couldn't get Bix pickles. She loves Bix pickles, that kind of thing. And she told me why. She said in Botsey, Ontario, they ship a lot of the pickles over, or the cucumbers over to Missouri, where they pickle them, and and then the top of the jar lid comes from Quebec, and they bring it over to to Missouri, and then because of Trump, they kind of grocers decided not to sell them anymore because of the tariffs. And you look at it, and one aha moment you realize that right now we're living in the battle of the supply chains. And this is where Indigenous communities, given the building it up with the right tools and the right course offerings to build up that capacity. And if MDA was able to partner with an institution like McGill and get the offsets that they're required. And then they start really accelerating this, because at the end of the day, this is what I think the Canadian government needs to do, or and the provincial government needs to do, in terms of, okay, well, if we're true partners in this, well, you're going to make you're going to make sure that everything's accessible. Education is accessible on and off reserve. So I just wanted to put that out there in the ether, as ideation, and and hear people's thoughts. I'll
Well, thank you for that, David. We just have a few minutes and everyone has sacrificed their lunch hour. So I don't know if I want to just pass, maybe give a minute each to Angela and Matt, and we can bid adieu
If I
to
could just
everyone.
jump in, Angela, because I want to
Sure.
endorse David here, because I think we have met with, we as an Indigenous Service Canada met with banks and leading Indigenous institutions the last couple of years. The banks acknowledge, and their willingness is increasing in terms of their to work with Indigenous communities to provide lower cost capital. There's still persistent challenges. They acknowledge that internally, cultural approaches, I'm not saying racial approaches, I'm saying the business culture within the banks seems to price capital for Indigenous communities disproportionate to the actual risk. They don't understand the communities well enough. So the more people we have in finance, business management, the better. We have lots of lawyers. I try and encourage as many people to enter the field of finance and business management as possible. So the sector is in badly need of Indigenous leadership and people understand Indigenous communities to accelerate the full inclusion of Indigenous communities in the economy.
And you don't have to be Indigenous to take the Indigenous Business Management program. And that's the whole point of allyship. So, yeah.
Thanks. Maybe Angela, if you have any words to add to close.
To close, well,
Well, I'll close out, but
yeah.
we'll let you go in a minute or two.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot more to say. And I also want to bring up awareness. Awareness is really important, and be that from both sides. And I have had a lot. I wanted to also mention the economic development organizations. I needed to shout out to them, because I think that's a fantastic group to reach out to, both at like CANDU, Council for Advancement of Native Development Officers, also the ECDEV agencies within the communities. I have found, like, for instance, in Kanawake, and the federal government folks, RDAs, they're really good also at bringing awareness of the existence of opportunity, of businesses that we can reach out to. And so I wanted to make sure that those folks got mentioned, and in terms of outreach and engagement, and the importance of that, keeping to talk, listen. That's don't know if anyone has any comment.
Well, thanks for mentioning that, Angela, because you're right. There is ways of working with the community and building allyship. So I think when you reach out to those communities, Angela, you're showing your sense of allyship, and I'm going to give you kudos for that. So.
Thank you.
Well, great. This runs us out to an hour, and I know this was over lunch hour, so it wasn't opportune for everyone. And I know both Matt and Angela, you've sacrificed this hour for us to discuss with our cohort here in our faculty who's interested to learn a little bit more about this. It's the niche area that David sort of runs here, and if anyone has any questions or concerns or issues they can go straight to David. He always loves talking about this. But thank you to Matt and Angela for giving us your time. We really appreciate these conversations. They're critical to the advancement of nation-to-nation reconciliation, and I'm really happy that you could make the time for us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone, and take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.